Alright guys, welcome back to the ArthroPod, podcast about all things entomology and exotic pets. I'm Dan, your host, lifelong bug nerd and zoologist. So to start, I just wanted to say a thank you to everybody who made the time to slog through last week's episode. It's a bit all over the place, but it was just a pilot, so hopefully moving forward things are going to be a wee bit more structured and hopefully a bit more interesting. This week we have got a pretty cool topic, so we're going to be considering and looking at some evidence for whether or not insects feel pain, which is going to be a massive importance to the hobby moving forward, especially when we think about stuff like how we keep our feeder insects or our insect pets. But it's also really important to science and the research, as there are going to be ethical considerations for some of the research we're carrying out in the space of entomology. This is actually a topic I've wondered about for a while. So obviously I work at Edinburgh Zoo and we use a lot of feeder insects. We're using them constantly and we're always using them live. They're kind of just thrown in. And you see some of the way animals hunt, it's not very nice. These insects, if they can feel pain, they've got a horrible time. And even in the lab, when I was doing my research stuff at Aberystwyth, I was working with invertebrates. One of the things I was doing is I was cutting off certain appendages of some of these invertebrates and then seeing if that affected how they were making mate choice and their courtship behaviour. And I'd done it without any anaesthetic or anything like that. So there's some real considerations here. Was that morally reprehensible, or did it not matter because these animals don't feel pain at all? So it's a really cool topic and one that I think is worth getting into. So a lot of this research on brain is going to revolve around the field of neurobiology within zoology and entomology. So if we're going to start thinking about if insects feel pain, we need to have a little bit of an understanding of some of these structures and the neurobiology behind arthropods' brain systems, really. So to start with, arthropods and insects have what we call a decentralized nervous system. So their brain is split up amongst multiple ganglia that are spread out over its entire body. In some insects, they can be fused together. In some of the flies, they can have a highly fused ganglionic system where it's much more like our brain. But really, their brains aren't anything like ours. So they were saying these insects have a series of nerve centres called ganglia that are split up along the body. What we might call the insect brain is made up of three of these ganglia fused together. And that's the protocerebrum, the jutocerebrum, and the tritocerebrum. And they're commonly fused to form what we call the supraesophageal ganglion, which is the big set of ganglions above the esophagus. And then the rest of the ganglia, they exist below the digestive tract, spread along the ventral surface. So they're below the alimentary canal and kind of against the underside. So this brain section of these three ganglion then connects to what we call the subesophageal ganglion. So below this brain, we have 3 thoracic ganglion and then around 8 abdominal ganglion. But again, they can be actually fused or separated. So it will change from arthropod to arthropod. These ganglions are made up of a whole bunch of nerve cells, mostly motor neurons and association neurons. Motor neurons are large kind of nerve centres and they're connected to contractile muscle and the neuropil. And the neuropil is like a mass of nerve fibres woven together. It's where a lot of neural connections happen, so it's where all the brain shit kind of moves through. And the association neurons, they tend to be small in your motor neurons, and they're connected to all the other parts of the nervous system. And all this is just to say, really, that invertebrate brains are entirely alien to us. I don't think it's fair to say that their brains are necessarily less complex, but they are definitely a more primitive form of sensory input and analysis for the animal. It's worth remembering that Arthropoda as a phylum is at least 500 million years old. Some research hinting that it might be close to 1 billion years old. That is a lot of time for these organisms to develop a fairly complex structure in their brain. Although we do see there's not a huge amount of changes to what we think this might be through the fossil record. So it's a primitive system, it's quite old, but there will be little changes that happen along the way in that. So for a quick look at what this insect brain might be, if it really is a brain, and it's worth noting that all arthropods have this segmentation of ganglia. So they've all got very similar structures and they're all going to share some similarities when it comes to how these brains work. So although we might be looking at different model systems as we're thinking about the brain, it's all going to kind of pull its way back towards Arthropoda as a phylum. So a lot of these decisions we make, or what we decide from these arguments, we can really push on to other insects and stuff because they do have similar systems. But now, let's think into how this plays around how animals experience the world, or how these insects experience the world. So we're going to think about a quick example that tarantula keepers might be familiar with. Quite often people will what we call pre-kill prey. So they'll decapitate their cockroaches or they'll crush their heads before they drop them into the enclosure. When you do that, what happens? Tell you now, what doesn't happen is that cockroach stays still and doesn't do anything. It can still show some fairly complex behaviours. I've seen cockroaches with crushed heads go into enclosures and they will still move around, they will still try and groom their legs, and they will still move away from touch. So there is still some input happening, and there must still be some interpretation of that input from those nerve cells and those nerve sense organs on the outside. But what we might consider its brain is missing. So how is that happening? If it doesn't have a head, it doesn't have those free-fused ganglion to produce that brain. So then what we need to think about, what does it mean then when an insect or an arthropod retreats from harmful stimuli? Is that because it is processing pain, or it knows that pain is going to happen, or it's predicting pain? Or is it a pre-programmed reflex, almost more like a machine trying to protect its parts? And that is a really hard question to answer, actually. So reflexes are automatic responses to stimulus. We have them, and a whole bunch of other animals and plants have them as well. And if you've ever touched a hot pan, you might notice that you reflexively pull your hand away before there is even any register of pain going on in your brain. Many arthropods have these same reflexive behaviours as we do. So for example, if you touch an ant's antennae, it might flinch away, but that doesn't prove any subjective experience of pain. And that subjective experience is an absolute mountain to climb in this topic, and it's one we're going to come back to in just a wee bit after we've looked at some of these model systems. And it's worth remembering that reacting to pain or reacting to harmful stimuli doesn't show pain, it only shows the ability to recognise damage to a system. And one of the things that we do know is that insects have what we call nociceptors. So these are commonly referred to as pain receptors, and these are receptors towards the end of nerve endings that can recognise harmful stimuli, and then they will send some sort of signal to the nervous system, normally in the form of an electrical signal. So for us, that electrical signal, say we touch a hot pan, our nociceptors register that, sends a signal to our spine, which sends it up to our brain, and then our brain is going to interpret that data, and it's going to add an emotional response to it. So that's when we start to register the pain. In insects, they have these nociceptors, and this signal is sent along to other parts of their nervous system, which is decentralised, not centralised like in us with our brain. It's spread out across. But what we see is that insects don't really have the same structures as us. So we can identify the areas in our brain that interprets this information of damage and translates it into the subjective experience of pain. It adds emotion to it. Insects don't appear to have these structures in their brain. They don't appear to have the same, what we might call complexity as us, to be able to do that. So we don't know if insects can process this signal of harm in the same way we can. So if we go back to the burning your hand thing, you touch that stove, that signal is sent through your body, it goes to your brain, and your brain kind of goes, oh fuck, don't do that, that was bad, don't do that again. If your pet mantis then was to touch a hot stove, you might see a similar response. You might see that leg retreating, you might see a limp, or avoiding to use that damaged appendage. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's in pain. That could just be reflex. It could be a programmed response within the organism to avoid further damage. So if it limps, it's less likely to cause more damage to that leg. If it tries to pull that leg away and shy it away, again, it's going to reduce damage to that leg, potentially not losing an entire appendage. And then when the next molt comes, doesn't have to put as much resources into rebuilding or repairing whatever it is that's been damaged. So the question is, does that mantis feel pain like we do, or is it more like a machine carrying out that pre-programmed code in order to help preserve itself? So I've been out sampling wasps before, so I like to catch a lot of wasps and identify them. They're one of the groups that I really love working with, and I have found it before where I will find some insectivorous wasps clutching onto caterpillars, and while they are eating the caterpillar is holding on to a small chunky leaf that it is still eating. So it's inconsistencies like this in behaviour where we're looking at it and thinking, well, that's not a response you're going to give if you're in pain. You're going to be trying to escape that wasp. It could also just be there's a hierarchical system in insect behaviour though. Maybe the wasp doesn't feel like as much a threat to the caterpillar as starvation does, or lack of resources. But it's things like this that makes us think, well, are insects actually capable of feeling pain? Or is it just these pre-programmed responses. So just a quick summing up of what we kind of know so far. Insects do have nervous systems, and they do have nociceptors. We also know that they will respond to harmful stimuli, but we don't know if they experience conscious suffering. Right, so now we've had a wee chat about some of the background biology around insect nervous systems. Let's have a wee look at some research. So we're going to look at 3 pieces of research using 3 different model systems, which is basically the organism they looked at when they were conducting this research. And from that, we're going to try and answer 3 different questions. 1, do they feel anything subjectively? 2, do they have negative affective states? So basically, can they suffer or do they suffer? And then 3, if they do, can we record this or how do we measure this? So the first bit of research we're going to be looking at is a paper from 2005 that used bees as our model system. This is a really simple piece of research. They had 2 chambers that bees had been trained to enter to get some nectar. In one chamber, if they entered, they would get an electric shock. In the other chamber, they wouldn't. What these researchers noticed after a very short time of doing this experiment was that bees, after just 1 or 2 shocks, would then consistently choose the chamber that didn't administer an electric shock. Now this is quite important because what it shows is that bees probably have a memory of harmful stimuli. They can remember about that harmful stimuli and they can then react to it. So it shows a learned avoidance of painful stimuli. So we already know that insects can respond to harmful stimuli. What this suggests is that they have a memory of that harmful stimuli as well. So this isn't a proof of suffering, but it is another clue in that case. So now we're going to jump forward to 2014, and we're going to look at a paper that moves away from insects. So this one uses crayfish as their model system. So again, this was another one where for some reason scientists decided to electrocute the animal, because scientists apparently just love electrocuting shit. So they took some crayfish, they put them in an enclosure and they administered electric shocks. They then took crayfish out of that enclosure and put it into another one. Then they observed the behaviours. What they noticed was that these crayfish started to display cautious behaviours. So they would move around slowly, they would freeze if there was any movement in the room, and they would try and hide. These were behaviours that seemed almost like anxiety to the researchers. So what these researchers then done was they used an anxiolytic drug. So a drug that's used in humans to reduce or treat anxiety disorders. They gave it to the crayfish and they noticed that very shortly after, the crayfish stopped displaying these cautious behaviours. They started acting like they would before the shock was administered. So what this kind of tells us is that there may have been an emotional response in crayfish to what we would consider a painful stimuli, and that we were able to treat this experience with chemicals, reducing those levels of anxiety. Now, we already know that there might be some aspect of emotionality in these animals because they have things like they excrete hormones like cortisol, which is quite commonly called the stress hormone. So their bodies are able to excrete that, and we do see some behaviours when it is excreted that's similar to how other model organisms, sometimes mammalian organisms, might experience stress or some symptoms that they might display in accordance to stressful stimuli or a sudden flush of this hormone. So it's something we kind of thought might have been there, but we've never really been able to truly document it before. And lastly, we're going to jump back to 2010 again, looking at some nociceptive response behaviour in some larval flies. So this was a paper looking at how flies react to harmful stimuli. So they were exposing these Drosophila larvae to what they call a noxious event, which is an event that causes some sort of pain or stress or heightened harm. And after a few of these events, they noticed that the behaviour of fly larvae was changing. There was long-term changes to foraging patterns and how the flies behaved around the presence of these harmful stimuli. Now again, this research isn't definitive, but what it shows is some higher thought around painful stimuli. They were able to remember the stimuli, they were able to respond to it, and they done so over a long term, changing their behaviour to respond to that painful stimuli, which makes us think they remember it as being painful or nasty in some way. Now this research into pain sensations is a relatively new field, or at least it's not been popular until quite recently. Don't know if you will have ever heard of the 2012 Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. And this is where a bunch of scientists from all over the world got together and they agreed that many non-human animals may experience some form of consciousness or higher level of sentience than we previously thought. For the guys out there that are interested in that, there's a really good book written by Dr. Lars Chitka called, I believe it's The Mind of a Bee. And it puts together some really good arguments looking at how bees are complex problem solvers and they're social animals, that bees experience at least a basic form of sentience. So not all researchers agree with this though. So a lot of people still say bees or insect brains, arthropod brains really, lack the required complexity and the structures to be able to process emotional events in the way that we can. So they might be able to experience these events, they might be able to recognise them as harmful to their body, but they might not have the required structures in the brain to be able to add emotion to that and translate that experience of harm into an experience of pain, at least one that they'll be able to remember. But there is also a group of scientists thinking they might experience some higher levels of sentience than we previously thought. So now, another quick summing up of some of the stuff we've chatted about. We know that insects have pain receptors, those nociceptors. We know that they're able to show avoidance and memory of harmful stimuli. We know that they're able to show anxiety-like responses. We have observed them changing behaviour based on harm. And there's a growing scientists that think they might experience some form of basic emotion, but there is also still scientists who think they lack the structures able to interpret those stimuli and convert it into a feeling of pain, convert it into emotion. And even if we go on the more cautious side of that, if bugs and insects and arthropods can feel pain, what does that mean for us as keepers? This is where the ethical considerations start to come in over just the scientific ones. This sort of alignment in thinking to we beasties not feeling any pain is perhaps why we rarely think of arthropods as having any sort of ethical worth in the world, outside the kind of conservation and ecology anyway. So for us, that a lot of that's going to come in with the feeder dilemma. We, pretty much all of us, will feed our pets live insects. And pre-killing is becoming more common, but I'd hardly say it's used by the majority of keepers yet. And I've got to say, I don't euthanize or anaesthetize any of my feeders before they go in with my animals. With the exception of maybe flies that I'll sometimes chill anaesthetise, but that's only to slow them down to make it easier for me to catch them. It's not actually, I'm not doing it for the welfare of the animal. And doing a little bit of research for this podcast, I'm starting to think this is something that I need to consider changing in my practice. Maybe I need to look at more ethical ways of using my feeders. Do I anaesthetise them? Do I chill anaesthetise them? Is there a way I can do it chemically instead? But then I've got to wonder, how are these chemicals going to play into the animals that I'm feeding them to? Are these chemicals still going to be present in the system? Things like that. There's a lot of considerations around this. But I do think if insects can feel pain, I definitely need to rethink the way I'm dealing with stuff. It's very unlikely that I will stop feeding insects to my animals just because they feel pain, but I might have to employ more pre-killed methods, so there's euthanasia happening before they are given to the animals for them to eat. Mantises are horrifying. I keep a fairly big collection of mantises, and if the mantis catches the locust upside down, it will eat it from the arse up. So that locust will still very much be alive as the mantis is eating its way up towards the head, which is that main processing centre for the insect. And if that's where those emotions are interpreted, there's going to be a bunch of signals being sent up, and it's going to be constantly realising how much danger it's going to be in. It's going to be releasing stress, it's going to be feeling pain, it's going to be feeling anxiety for that whole situation, which they can take half an hour to eat. So it maybe really is something that I need to consider changing when I'm with my animal. You'll have to let me know what you guys think. Do you pre-kill? Do you think it's a good thing to do? Do you not care? Or are they just insects so they didn't matter? Do you not think that insects can experience pain? Have you got any personal stories that make you think, well, actually, I don't think they do because this happened when I was feeding or whatever? Let me know. But then insects aren't just used in the pet trade. If insects do feel pain, this is going to affect many other areas. There is growing work on insects in agriculture. So we are using insects to pollinate a lot of areas. We are using more and more insect as a protein source, which will likely, they reckon by 2050, there's a good chance the main ingredient in a lot of protein-rich meals is going to be insect protein, whether it's ground up like crude ash to be putting into stuff. And insects are used very widely in research, not just insects, a lot of inverts, because there is very little welfare laws. They have very simple or very primitive systems that are easy for us to navigate through and to alter. And they're easy to get a hold of, they're cheap, they're easy to rear, and they don't have long generational times if we're doing any studies, so we can look at offspring very quickly. It's very unlikely we're going to change a lot. Insects are still going to be used in research, people are still going to spray their homes when they find cockroaches, and I am still going to feed bugs to my bugs. You might have noticed that I've been using bug and insect and invertebrate and stuff, kind of. I've been using bug interchangeably for a lot of these things. I do know that bugs are the hemipterans and there is the true bugs, but it's just a habit I'm in. Everything's a bug to me. So don't fucking attack me for calling them bugs. They're all bugs. But anyway, perhaps what we need is just something a bit more like a keeper's code, a moral code that keepers can follow. Could be really simple. So at Edinburgh Zoo, we kind of use one where we respect insects and feeders as living animals. We minimise suffering where possible. We show compassion to these animals where we're able to. And we try to stay up to date and informed in these conversations around insect pain and suffering. So maybe if we can introduce something like that to the hobby a little bit wider, it could do us a world of good. So, do insects feel pain? We are not 100% sure, but we do know they detect harm. We know they avoid it. We know some of them remember and some of them change their behaviour. And more, the evidence is suggesting that they feel something. So then the question really becomes, how do we treat those who might be suffering? And that's not just a scientific question, that's an ethical and moral one. It's a personal question. And it's going to revolve a lot around what you feel comfortable with. So now we are going to move on to a keeper story, talking about how somebody got into keeping reptiles, which is really cool. This was submitted to me today from a member of the Tarantula and Beginner Discord group who goes by the name of The Carrot. So it's about Janeway, the rescue ball python. And it starts with, "Hi. So my husband and I got a baby corn snake a couple of months ago. I've always liked snakes but never had one as a pet. My husband works at Petco and fell in love with a baby corn snake. Like 3 weeks after we got Cinnamon the corn snake, Nat was looking through Craigslist for an upgrade for her old A. Seamani rescue. She's 15 plus who likes to dig. So they were looking for a bigger terrarium on Craigslist. And he found her 20 long, and when he went to pick it up, there was a snake that came with the tank. After talking with the guy, the poor ball python hadn't had a water bowl in 3 months and wasn't taking food. We're 90% certain he was putting a frozen mouse in there then taken out. Not thawed, just frozen. She was kept on wood chips without any hides, but she had a UVB. First day we soaked her. Yes, you shouldn't soak ball pythons, but this was an emergency /ICU type situation. Poor thing gained 2 grams from drinking water. Also got some of the stuck shed off her. Got her some hides set up in a 20 long we had kicking around that we knew was clean and sterile. Took her to the exotic vet. She drank so much water from her water bowl, vet basically said either she has a virus or parasite and won't make it, or it's just neglect and she will. So she was weighed 46 grams, tube fed, given vitamin A shots, antibiotic shots. She was too dehydrated to give fluids to or take a blood sample from though. We then spent the next month giving her antibiotic shots every 3 days, feeding her every 3 days and soaking her every day. She's now 56 grams and hasn't turned down any meals we've offered. We have been starting her back on food per the vet direction to avoid her regurgitating. So at first it was 1 pinky, then 2 pinkies 12 hours apart, then moved the feedings closer together and now she takes 2 pinkies 15 minutes apart. We just have to heat it to 85 degrees Fahrenheit surface temperature and she strikes and takes it. The first time she ate for us, she launched her skinny self so hard at it, she took the tongs out of my husband's hands. We have a follow-up appointment with the vet on Thursday. She's now in a big girl enclosure. We made hides out of soup cups we bought at a Dollar Tree at 9 PM as we ransacked it for anything we could make into hides before it closed that first night we had her. She slept and didn't move for so long we were worried we were too late. After the vet visit, we used some placemats to make a screen around to make her feel more private. Covered the tank to help keep humidity in and cleaned out her old tank to turn into a planted tank. The wood chips were so bad I spent 30 minutes pulling splinters out of my husband's hands. She gained weight, pooped and was active and got the okay from her vet to go to a bigger enclosure. We got a frog to put in our old planted tank and also picked up a leopard gecko. That's awesome. So it's one of those things, if you're looking to get into the reptile hobby, really consider a rescue or look at rehoming. There are so many animals out there that are amazing animals, but they're just being kept in such bad situations that it's heartbreaking. Our ball python, Serene, she was a rehome. She was a rescue that we got, and she's amazing. She's such a good animal. Fortunately, as I said, there's a lot of snakes out there that are up for rehome, a lot of reptiles, and there's a few things that kind of play into that. So first, a lot of these reptiles have a fairly cheap beginner setup. Now, if you're looking to get a snake, you can get an entire snake kit, sometimes including a snake in the UK, for less than £150. The problem with that is, though, people will have them for a while, and then as their snake grows, they will quickly find out that it's quite expensive to upgrade. So, you will go from this £150 kit that included your snake to next thing you're looking at having to pay £400 just for the next size up to terrarium to keep your ball python in as it starts to grow, or vivarium. Another thing is, unfortunately, kids get bored. The nature of these ectothermic animals is they aren't always active. They're taking in the heat from the environment and then they're using that to urge their productivity. And if you're feeding those animals and you're bringing the food for them, they really don't have any reason to be out. There's only 3 reasons that a lot of animals leave their houses or their hides. One is water, the second is food, and the third is sex. So they're looking to reproduce. If you're providing 2 out of those 3, there is almost no reason for your snake to leave its hide. It's got a nice warm area, it's getting food delivered to it, why would it move? And unfortunately, kids get bored with that. And it's rarely ever the animals that want the pets, it's the kids. So as the kids gets bored, the adults see that, and then the adults are having to deal with things like maybe cleaning out the enclosure every now and then, maybe having to change the bedding if they're using that nasty aspen stuff. And they're having to feed things like dead mice and some of the bigger snakes, dead rabbits and stuff. And they're just not happy with it, they don't like it. So once the kids stop showing interest, they pop it up for rehome and they forget that it even existed. I think there's another thing about, if you've had a pet, you've likely had a cat or a dog, and reptiles a lot of the time just aren't as charismatic as those animals. So again, people get bored with them. They don't seem to have as much of a personality, although I'd argue all these animals have their own personality. And a lot of the time reptiles are seen more as a display animal than actually a pet. So these people never develop a bond with their animal. They never feel like they connect to it. And then because of that, animals are popped up. But if you can rescue, I thoroughly recommend it. Really, get one, look after it, you'll feel so much better about yourself, and you'll have a really cool animal to show your mates and your family when they come over. So that's awesome to hear that. I am always looking for more stories to read out on this podcast, so if you've got any, please send them my way. Any sort of funny keeper stories, any experiences of how you got into the hobby, anything that's happened to you lately, any updates on your collection if you're planning to listen regularly and inform us regularly. What I'm also looking for is stories about near misses, things that went wrong and you had to deal with and how you dealt with it. One of the things that I think is really important, especially when you get onto YouTube and that, is all these collectors show these pristine collections. They never talk about the things that go wrong, they just show everything that's going right. And when you're coming into a hobby, that can be quite overwhelming when things do start to go wrong. You can feel like a horrible keeper. You can feel like you're just out of your depth. I know, for example, one of the first tarantulas I ever got was an OBT, which is generally considered an advanced species. And my first experience of that was spending a good 20 minutes, half an hour, chasing it around the table in the living room where I opened it, because I opened the vial to have a little look. Then I thought, I'll just place that in the enclosure and close the lid. As soon as I dropped that vial in, the OBT shot out the vial, it shot out of the container, and it was under the desk before I could really even register it was gone. A lot of people don't talk about that. They just talk about how easy it is, and they show the nice rehousings. So even when I do a rehousing, I'm cutting down my footage, and I'm taking 15-20 minutes of waiting for a spider to leave a cup and putting it down into a 7-second segment. So you're seeing that and you're thinking, oh, all you need to do is put in the cup and it goes out, and then you think, oh, this is taking too long, I'll start to nudge it out, and then things go wrong very quickly. I think it's something we do need to address in YouTube. So yeah, any near misses and stuff, brilliant stories to send in. Or just even any other hobbies. It might be a hobby about somewhere you've been and you've seen some animals. So I'm hoping to talk about some of the stuff that I done when I was in Peru, and some of the stuff I seen in Florida and Australia and China as well, which I think will be really cool. And some of the stories for stuff I've done around the UK. So anything you'd love to write in with, I am more than happy to read out on the podcast. Alright guys, I am just sat editing the video, but I had a really cool listener submission that I would love to read to you guys. So I had an idea for a cool or a recurring segment that I think might be quite cool, called Pet Peeves, where I get you guys to write in with any rants about the hobby, whether that's entomology or keeping tarantulas or other exotic pets and stuff like that. I put out the feelers and asked a couple of keepers that I know if they wanted to submit one, and one of them did. So this is a lassie I know who has been keeping tarantulas for a long time and goes by the name on Discord 8 Hairy Legs Mummy 86, which is an interesting name, and I'm not sure you'll get the right responses for some people with that, but it's a good one. She's a lovely person and she definitely knows her stuff about tarantulas. So it reads, "Hi Dan, this is my first time writing into any podcast. I've been loving your YouTube channel and was so excited to see you started a podcast. Anyway, I had to write in when you mentioned pet peeves in the hobby because oh boy do I have one. And it's people who tap on the glass or blow on their tarantulas to make them move and then film it like it's entertainment. I don't know who needs to hear this, but your spider isn't dancing, it's stressed out of its little exoskeleton. We go on and on about how we want to educate, raise standards, stop fear-mongering, and then someone's out here poking a Kilobrachus for TikTok fame. Drives me up the wall. Enrichment and interaction? Great. Gently guiding for rehousing? Fine. But let the poor things chill. Thanks for giving me a space to rant respectfully. Even if you don't read this one out, keep doing what you're doing. Your science segments are a treat. Cheers." So, there's a few things there. I don't disagree with this. Poking tarantulas and tapping on the glass is not good for them. We've just had a whole segment where we've been talking about how these tarantulas might experience pain, or how these arthropods might experience pain, and also how they get stressed out. And they do experience cortisol. We talked about that slightly. That definitely stresses them out. They release that hormone. It's probably an uncomfortable experience. It's a bit like when stress floods our body. And there is a problem with people doing it on YouTube. And I know how tempting it is when you're recording a video and you just want that one little few second segment of your tarantula moving and it does nothing but stand still. Usually because we've got big lights shining on them and stuff like that. But I know how tempting it is to just give it a little blow or touch it, but that is not good for our tarantulas, and it's not then what we want people to see. We don't want to put these videos on of massively active tarantulas, and then people get those species and they aren't doing that. Especially juveniles. People need to be prepared for the idea that your juvenile might spend all of its time in its burrow, and the only time you see it really is after, or a couple of days after a fresh molt, when it's starting to get thirsty and hungry again. People need to be prepared for that, and we do need to stop putting out these false standards out there, and we need to think about the welfare of our animal. At the end of the day, our animal should always come first, which is something my girlfriend likes to remind me in the morning when I make my coffee before I let the dog out or feed the cats. So yeah, absolutely 8 Hairy Legs Mummy 86, and thank you for writing in. Any other pet peeves, guys, send them in. I would love to hear them. But alongside the pet peeve segment, I am also going to look for a question and answer segment, or ask a keeper a question segment. So I do have one here that was submitted, and we'll read it out to you guys and see what we think. So hey Dan, first off, I just wanted to say I love the ArthroPod. I stumbled across it while trying to figure out if I was brave enough to actually own a tarantula, and now I'm weirdly obsessed. You make it all sound so fascinating and way less intimidating than most of the YouTube rabbit holes I've been down. So here's my question. How do I actually start? What's the best first species if I don't want to mess up? I keep seeing conflicting stuff. Some people say get a sling so you can raise it from tiny. Others say that's a disaster waiting to happen. Then there's the whole enclosure thing. Do I need a heat map? Is mesh a death trap? Why is substrate so controversial? I just want to do it right and not kill my first tarantula. If you've got any tips or even just a here's what I wish I knew when I started, I'd be super grateful. Thanks for making all this seem accessible, Hannah. So there was a few questions in there. First, I think this is coming from a good place, and don't feel out of your depth with this. All of us, when we were first getting our tarantula, nobody wants to mess up. Nobody goes into this thinking, oh, I don't care what happens to the animals. Generally, if you're going to invest in one of these things, it's because you like animals and because you care about them. So I completely get the apprehension when you're thinking about getting one, but I would say don't stress so much. Spiders, especially tarantulas, are a lot more hardy than I think we give them credit for. Saying that doesn't mean we want to keep them wrong or keep them in a way that might induce stress in the animal, but they are a lot hardier than people say, and mistakes do happen. I think that's one of the first things we need to get out there. When you're a new keeper, mistakes will happen. It's a natural part of the hobby. You don't have to be happy that they happened, but you just need to kind of accept that there will be mistakes and learn and move on from that. That's the most important part. So what were the first questions again? I've written this one down because there's a few in there. So here's my question. How do I actually start? That is really simple. Get a spider, get a box, see how you go. So it's actually really easy to keep some tarantulas. If you are in the UK, Invert Shows is a brilliant place to start. So Invert Shows UK does a whole bunch of expos around the country. There is actually one in Glasgow that will be coming up not long after this video is released actually, which I am going to, and now it seems like I am going to be recording the official video for Invert UK, so you might see me on their YouTube and Facebook page doing some of the interviews and stuff, which is cool. But yeah, go to an expo. You'll get a couple of things from that. You will be able to meet the vendors and ask them their advice on tarantulas and species and certain species that are there. You will also be able to see the tarantulas to make sure they are in good health, and you will get things cheaper. A lot of the vendors will also be happy to help you set up an enclosure there and then to take away with you. Okay? So, for example, one of my favourite vendors is Luke from Spa Spiders. He has an amazing name in the UK, keeps his spiders with brilliant ethical considerations in mind, and he is an absolute fountain of knowledge. If you go to Luke and you tell him you're about to get into the hobby and you're looking for your first tarantula, I can pretty much guarantee you that he will be ecstatic and he will do everything he can to help. I know the spider shop as well. I was listening to one of their interviews for the Invert show, and they were saying that if somebody comes to them wanting a new spider, they will. Obviously they'll sell them the spider, but they're also happy to then sell them everything else they need for the stuff. Bearing in mind you're going to get it cheaper because it's an expo, and they will help you set up that enclosure there and then to take away with you. So you don't want to put the spider in there and then you probably want to still transport in the little box, but they will help you put in all the substrate and everything else you need. Set you up with a water dish, and then you will take that spider away with a set up enclosure that when you get home, all you need to do is transfer the spider into it. So that's a really good place to start. If you're not wanting to start at an expo, I would recommend just looking online or looking up for some other groups for people willing to sell tarantulas. So I probably wouldn't recommend straight away people willing to sell tarantulas online, because you might not get any guarantees with that, and some people could just be looking to offload slings because they've got too many. They've maybe had a breeding attempt and they're inundated with slings, they're flooded with them, and they're just trying to get them away as quickly as possible. That's when quite often you might end up with a tarantula that perhaps isn't very well suited for a beginner. But look on the websites. A lot of websites will have beginner packages. What I would say is, don't be tempted to go for the cheapest option and get a sling. Okay? Start with a tarantula that is at least a juvenile, or maybe even I would recommend a sub-adult is a good choice. There's a couple of reasons for that. Slings can be quite almost temperamental in their keeping. It's not so much that they're hard to keep, it is just that it's easy to get wrong. It's quite easy to put in too much moisture, too much water. It's quite easy to disturb the substrate. It's quite easy to poke them if you get a little bit worried and try to look for them while they're molting. And it's quite easy to put in prey that's maybe a little bit too big for them or could actually harm them in the long run. So it's not uncommon that people have put in crickets for their slings to find out actually the cricket was a little bit too big. And even worse, it's ate the tarantula. Maybe even after a molt or just because it was that much bigger than it. But also, slings are quite boring. If you get a sling, it's going to take you a couple of years till you get it to the point where it's a tarantula that you can kind of see, that's going to be moving around the enclosure and that you can show to people. So you're probably going to get put off quite quickly if you've got a sling. It's just going to sit in a little tub on your shelf and you're never going to see it. And then you might be tempted to put it into an enclosure that's too big, and then that comes with all these other problems like escape and it not being able to find prey or not being able to find the water source. And then get a suitable enclosure. When you're looking at enclosures, there's a pretty good rule of thumb. You want the enclosure, its width and length, to be about 3 to 4 times the size of the tarantula's diagonal leg span. So that's measuring from, say, the top left leg to the bottom right leg, right across the body. And that will give you an enclosure that tarantulas are able to move around in. Once you've got like a juvenile or sub-adult, something like an 8 by 8 inch cube, or I like the 8 by 8 by 11 inch enclosure so they're a little bit taller, will be grand for your tarantula. If it is a fossorial or terrestrial tarantula, you want to fill it up with quite a lot of substrate, because if they climb and they fall, they're going to hurt themselves. If it's an arboreal one, You just put a little bit of substrate in and that gives it its climbing space. That's why I prefer the tall enclosures, because you can always fill up the enclosure to make the height that the tarantula can move not as much, but you can never really add height on the enclosure if you get one of the small ones. You can also just keep them in tubs. So you can get stuff like I've got for just the guys who are just listening, I have got this clear cereal tub from B&M, which is like a bargain store in the UK. I've drilled a couple of ventilation holes in it, some near the bottom, some near the top, to provide airflow, and that is brilliant for rearing juvenile tarantulas, especially arboreal ones. Also stuff like the really useful boxes, commonly just get called rubs in the hobby. They're so common that people just call them rubs, and they're used all the time. They're good because they have locking lids. Again, you can drill the ventilation, and they're brilliant for tarantulas. If anything, they're better than a lot of the glass enclosures, because although you can't see the tarantula as much, that gives them a little bit of privacy, and it traps heat and moisture a little bit more. So there's loads of options for it, and it's quite easy to research this on YouTube. There's a lot of us making care guides and stuff on YouTube now. It is not as hard to find the information as it used to be. As I said, if you go to an expo, you'll be surrounded by experts who are more than happy to help you. They're not just trying to sell you a tarantula, they're trying to spread the hobby. They want to give you that advice. It's better in the long run to get somebody hooked into the hobby than to have them buy one tarantula, have a bad experience and never go back. So they're going to give you good advice. I would say go to one of them over somewhere like Pets at Home. So I believe Hannah is from the UK. So don't go to somewhere like Pets at Home. Those guys tend not to really know what they're talking about when it comes to exotic pets. Probably not much more than somebody who's read half a Wikipedia page. It's not their fault, it's just the training from the company. So yeah, go to a specialist vendor if you're going to get it. So that was kind of how do I start, we're going to that. Then it was, what is the best first species if I don't want to mess up? As I say, don't worry about messing up. It will happen. You don't want to just have a lackadaisical approach so it's going to happen all the time, but you need to be kind of ready for that, and you need to be willing to learn from it and move on. In terms of good beginner species, Clitocatl albopolosis, the curly-haired tarantula, is a brilliant first species. The only thing with species like that is they grow slowly. So again, they're not too slow growing as slings, but once they get to the juvenile and adult stages, they're quite slow growing. So I would go with something like that. It's going to be nice and slow growing. They're fairly bomb proof. They can go through a lot of different environmental setups, so they can get quite dry. They can also withstand humidity, so if you do maybe overwater or you forget to water 1 week, it's not going to kill them off. They can be quite temperamental feeders. Sometimes they can go off food for a long time, especially coming into molts, which can take them a long time to molt. My female recently just took nearly 4 months to go through a molt, and she refused to eat for the last 2 months at least. So you need to be prepared for stuff like that. So you've got to kind of learn not to worry about your tarantula as well. Another species that I always recommend to beginners is the Lasiodora parabiana. That is the salmon pink bird eater. It is an amazing tarantula. There's 2 things you need to be aware of with it though. They have quite nasty hairs they can kick, and they get big quite fast. So they're a fast-growing species, which I actually think is one of the pros as well. So this is a spider you can get as a juvenile, and after just a year or two, it is going to be a big spider. So these spiders are quite cheap. You can get a juvenile for about £15. They're readily available. If somewhere sells tarantulas, they will sell Lasiodoras, or we just call them LPs. They are fairly easy to care for. You just need to pop in some cocoa coir, just need to pop in a hide, maybe a bit of cork bark or something, a little water dish. Try and feed them once a week. If they don't take it, just take it out. And just overflow the water dish every now and then. That'll help keep up the humidity. I would also recommend just a little bit of sphagnum moss in one of the corners that you keep damp as well, and that's also going to keep up the humidity for the animal. As I said, it will grow quite quickly, so you might need to go up through enclosures, but if you're just using like these plastic boxes, you're going to be absolutely fine. It's going to cost next to nothing to upgrade them. And after a couple of years, you will have a monster specimen. These guys get big. They can rival the Goliath bird eaters. They're massive tarantulas. I think they're quite often considered like the 4th or 5th largest spider in the largest tarantula in the world anyway. They get moved down to like 6th or 7th once you start looking at some of the true spiders as well. But they are amazing spiders. They're active. They have good prey drive. They're quite kind of charismatic for a spider as well. You see a lot of personality in them. So that's a really good one to go with. And then I think another absolutely bomb-proof tarantula is Brachypelma hormorii. So that's the Mexican red knee. It's one of my favourite species. It is a very slow-growing species. It's like the pet rock of the hobby. They're not, I wouldn't say they're active, but they're usually out on the top of their enclosure. They like to be kept dry. So you just give them a water dish, you don't need to really worry about humidity, and you give them food every now and then, and they've got a pretty good prey drive, so when you drop the food in, they probably will go for it. But those ones can be quite expensive. So you might be, sometimes for an adult, you could be looking at paying between 40 and 70, 80 pound for one of these. If you are getting a set spider, I would recommend going with a female, simply because females live longer than your males. Your male you might have for around 5 years if you have it from a sling. Females can be, 15, 20, sometimes 35 and 40 years if you're looking at some of the Grammostolas. So they can be really long-lived. But females are good to have because you'll have it for a long time, and you will get attached to your tarantula. You won't think you will, but you'll absolutely get attached. And was there any other questions? Do you need a heat map? It really depends. I use a heated room, so my room is held at about 25 degrees Celsius, so I don't use heat mats except for my animals that need slightly higher heat. So for example, my snakes need about 30, 33 degrees to be able to digest, so they have got a heat mat in there with a thermostat that keeps an area at about that heat. When I change the enclosure, it will be going up to a lamp. Tarantulas, pretty much any tarantula will be happy at around that 25 degree mark. So we tend to say about room temperature. Problem is some people have hot or cold rooms. So about 25 degrees is a good mark, just like your tropical fish tanks. Mesh. Now, ideally, you don't want mesh on a container, at least not mesh where it's interwoven, so bits of mesh cross over each other. And that is because the little hooks on the toes of the tarantula can get caught under that mesh. If it is like a mesh, what you want is punched metal. So instead of it being little wires interwoven, it is little holes that are punched out of a thin sheet of metal to produce the ventilation. So yeah, mesh isn't a great thing to have. If you do use mesh, you will probably never see a problem. But in my opinion, it is not worth the risk when you can get punched mesh enclosures. And anything that's sold as a tarantula enclosure should hopefully be that punched metal rather than the mesh. And then why is substrate so controversial? Honestly, that's not something I know either. Some people are really funny about how long you have to bake substrate. Some people say cocoa coir isn't a massive no-no. Some people say it is absolutely perfect for your tarantula. You should keep it damp, you should keep it dry. It's all going to depend on your tarantula. So this is the type of thing when you know which tarantula you're going to get, do a little bit of research and you'll find out what substrate it needs. I mix my own substrate, so it's always unique to the tarantula. It's always personalised. I like to use organic topsoil mixed with something like tortoise substrate, and then I add in bits and pieces depending on what that spider expects. If it likes a lot of humidity, I chop up some sphagnum moss and I mix that into the soil as well. If it doesn't like as much humidity, I might put in some sand so the soil is a little bit more free draining. If it likes to burrow, I will include some cocoa coir because that tends to hold burrows quite well. So you can change it depending on the spider, but unfortunately you're going to need to get to know the tarantula before you can decide which substrate to put in. So thank you. That is an awesome question and one that I think a lot of people will have been asking themselves. If anyone else has any other questions, send them in. I am more than happy to try and answer them. And if not, I have got some very knowledgeable friends. I will get them to answer them as well. But thank you very much, Hannah. Right guys, thank you for listening to episode 1 of the ArthroPod podcast. If you're interested, give me a little like and follow. I am going to see about getting these podcasts put up onto some of the other stuff like Spotify and that as well, if there's any just listeners out there rather than the guys watching the video podcasts. And yeah, I will see you next week. Cheerio and Rasta.